The Secure in Mind podcast series is an educational initiative of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, or CIAN. CIAN is an international not-for-profit trust network of experts in technology, policy, ethics, and good practice. Our mission is to strengthen society's safety, resilience, and ability to fight against cybercrime and similar threats. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network. And we're back from the John is a cheap bastard induced brief Zoom recording pause. So hi again, Bjørn, and let's continue. Let's pick up where we left off in our last session. And I want to start right off by provoking a little bit. Let's talk about freedom of speech.
Yeah.
So in the United States, freedom of speech is enshrined in the First Amendment of their Constitution, right? In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I forget which article it is, but
19?
19? Man, if you have that one memorized, I really need to read through it. Yeah, everybody has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, interestingly worded, right? We have, I think, three related concepts, which is freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and freedom of expression.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have, and I'll post the exact articles, paragraphs in the notes. We have, for example, in the German Constitution, we have bans on certain uses of extremist symbology.
Yeah.
Right? We have this in a lot of countries. I believe Finland just recently criminalized Holocaust denialism.
Yeah.
Switzerland, France, other countries have this. Spain, where I live, funny enough, does not have bans on Nazi symbols, which is me finding swastikas spray painted on a wall near here and promptly running out to get some white paint was a bit surprising, and people still giving fascist salutes in Italy. So
yeah.
Cultural differences, right? 80 years
also
ago,
historic differences, right?
Historic differences, not a little bit more than 80 years ago, we thankfully got rid of Nazis for good and forever in Europe, and they will never come back again.
Sure.
One can hope.
Says the man living in Spain.
Says the man living in Spain. So we have it's one of the things that gets thrown up very often in especially online conversations. We were just talking about tracking of right-wing symbology, dog whistles, hate speech, whether blatant, right? I hate group XYZ, we should kill group XYZ, calls to violence, or more subtle, right? I'm just asking questions about so-and-so.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about these limits, right? It's very often, there is a legitimate question about freedom of speech, freedom of conscience is a foundational factor of a liberal, open society.
Yeah.
Then we have Karl Popper, right? And this idea that, well, if you're calling for the dismantling of the mechanisms that guarantee free speech, that is not part of your freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Where are the limits? And this is a very, very broad question. A lot of this gets in a bit of philosophical differences, right? Where are the limits? What have we been seeing from extremist groups in terms of messaging? Well, we need to be allowed to express ourselves. So why are you stepping on my freedoms?
Yeah. No, and there's different approaches here, right? In general, from the philosophical perspective, my goal is as much freedom for as many people as possible. Right.
You mentioned in your very first episode that one of the things that terrorism seeks to do is to remove diversity.
Yeah. No, so terrorism seeks to narrow down and have freedoms for a restricted subset of people. What I want to do is open that up and have as much freedom as possible for everyone. Quite often, extremist and terrorist groups want their freedoms at the cost of the freedoms of others. Well, they always want it at the cost of the freedoms of others. So there's kind of those elements where I'm striving for as much freedom as possible for as many people as possible. In order to do that, we need to protect people from the people who are trying to restrict the freedoms for others. So, Karl Popper. But also, terrorists kill people, which ultimately is a really severe way of silencing them. if you are dead, your freedom of expression is moot because you're dead and thus cannot express yourself anymore. So like ultimately, like a lot of what we're working on is like keeping people alive, right? So that they can express themselves. And so
Well, it's kind of
just like the
your Maslow's pyramid of needs. I mean, that's kind of the most fun. Life is like the very first thing. That's kind of an underlying assumption.
yeah, being alive is turns out
Sort of.
really important to be able to exercise all other rights, right? So yeah. That's kind of where I'm coming at it from. I've got a couple of copies of the U.S. Constitution, Norwegian Constitution, Spanish Constitution, Mexican Constitution, etc. Like in this massive stack next to my desk that I don't dare move right now because it will collapse and like kill my dog. But familiar with the law and the concept of the rights.
It's funny. I think I somehow sometimes get the impression that a lot of the people who very consistently quote Constitution, especially in the U.S., but not only, they actually haven't read the damn thing.
Well, all of them have read the first two amendments to the Constitution and nothing else. Certainly not the 14th, which, is where things get really interesting sometimes.
We can spend an hour on that.
Yeah, this is kind of like how I get in nerddom trouble as well. But ultimately, like, my goal is rooted in human rights, like, and fundamental rights and the idea of equality before the law, not the least, which is another fundamental right. Like, how do we protect the rights of the most people possible? So
it's almost a utilitarian approach. It's what is the biggest benefit for the most people, in a way.
Oh, definitely a utilitarian approach. So yeah.
Yeah. But
I don't know if that answers the question, but
I don't think anything will answer the question because it's one of these weird things that I always cite Germany, right? Germany is like any system. It's far from perfect. It has its issues. We have problems we've had problems with restrictions of rights. We had in the 1960s, there were issues with former unrepentant recidivist ex-Nazis being in at the levers of power, still a big issue that led to, the 1968 student protests. We had restrictions on individual freedoms, in pursuit of the RAF and other terror groups in the 70s, Bader-Meinhof and company. And even today, there's issues with, for example, in the military and some law enforcement, some right wing. But at the same time, Germany, for me, is one of the countries with not only a complicated history, but that's also managed to fundamentally and very consistently reconcile, individual rights and liberties with a need to the Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the dealing with the past, this understanding that, look, if we let this prosper, then we have a big problem. And this is, you mentioned the AfD in our last session.
Yeah.
This is, and before that, it was what was the right-wing party that was banned? I don't remember the name of it. But this is this whole thing about, well, if you look at, for example, voting results from the last parliamentary election in Eastern Germany, in the former DDR states, the AfD is massively present, despite, being somewhere around 20% of the national electorate. And how do we reconcile, this liberty with the need to protect constitutionality and individual rights? And, I had this long conversation with my father recently, who is, gone from being a very solidly kind of right of center moderate to very, very kind of left of center. And then now with a lot of the disinformation happening, there are sometimes very worrisome points that he says, which is basically, well, what about France, where Marine Le Pen polls very, very highly, and these extremely right-wing groups that border on her, even more right-wing, it's the will of the people, and we have to respect that, even if we don't let them into power. How do we stop people from spewing hate online while still respecting the need to be able to shitpost online, and do things that other people may just think is distasteful but not harmful?
Yeah, I mean, like, personally, I've done plenty of shitposting and distasteful stuff online, right?
Guilty.
It keeps keeps happening somehow. We try to be funny and then often fail.
We are products of our generation, honestly.
Yeah. We might be different generations. I don't know if I'll
Oh,
be
sorry.
insulted
Okay,
by that.
that was a side swipe there. Okay.
Um,
It's
but yeah, where to start? So I think like part of where you can start kind of the analysis here is like the purpose of constitutions in the first place, which is to limit the power of the masses to be tyrants. Like the goal of democracy and the goal of the existence of law and order is that a majority of population shouldn't be able to subjugate the minority of population in different ways. Like the point of rights is to protect the marginalized. And so there's kind of that element where if you bring it down to like the bare bones, like, yeah, we have rights. The point of the rights is to protect the rights of all these people. If you are then not protecting the rights, then like, or if you're directly attacking the rights, then that becomes a problem. And like what we're seeing enacted when some of these guys get power in different ways and through more or less democratic means, right, is that they go after academic institutions, they go after like the bearers of civic discourse, whether that is civil society organizations. We've seen like crackdowns on civil society organizations now in Russia, in Hungary, Serbia has been having some real challenges lately, etc.
US.
And like these are the spaces that are developed to protect the rights of the minorities. It's developed to enshrine and ensure that constitutionality is secured. And so by deconstructing that, oppressive regimes are limiting the freedoms of people. And so our job is generally to kind of protect that, and protect that for everyone, even bad comedians. What becomes problematic is kind of like the boundaries of rights, like where you start using your rights in order to take away from my rights. And so, you know, your freedoms only extend to the tip of my nose is kind of a fairly kind of common concept here.
I was going to actually mention that quote. Of it's often attributed, misattributed to. I see it Oliver Wendell Holmes, former American Supreme Court Justice. I see it John Stuart Mill. I see about three other people. It's supposed to, Abraham Lincoln, Winston
Mark Twain is always in there.
Mark Twain on Twitter, circa
Yeah,
1967, right?
probably. Yeah.
Never believe anything you read on the internet.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's that how it seems to go very strongly in the direction of what you touched on last time is the contextualization, right?
Yeah.
Context matters.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be an element of subjectivity in this. There's always, I think this is why we as societies have to have strong foundational principles.
Yeah.
We like to talk about principles driven regulation. That can then be used. That can then be. There will always be wiggle room interpretation. There will always be people who unfairly get caught up in this. I think it sucks, but it's the price of having that kind of mechanism, as opposed to having these totally non-negotiable always black and white, no exceptions rules, which will equally end up with problems.
It's kind of the cost of freedom is that sometimes you have to pay the cost of freedom, right?
Yeah.
And I think like that's one concept, but also like one of the things that's often missed from the discourse is that like a lot of like our clients, largely being like social media platforms, etc., like they don't determine whether you end up in jail for what you're saying or not, right? Like we aren't like that your shit posting is being moderated is a consequence of your shit posting, but it's not gonna threaten your like civil liberties necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
There's debate over like whether some platforms have monopolized speech to the extent where it does, and like that's valid discussions to be had. But at the same time, like a lot of the times we're talking about like Yeah, the fact that you're an asshole has social consequences.
It's freedom of speech, not freedom from consequences, I think, is one of the things
Yeah,
that's cited.
exactly. And so like, yeah, you're an asshole and someone objects to you being an asshole and like, or like you're an asshole and you lose your job for being an asshole in public. Like, it happens, man. Like, um, maybe,
There's a couple of groups that they actively call it vigilantism, whatever you will. They go and track down people who are making right wing hate speech statements
yeah,
online, primarily, right, not exclusively. Terrorism is not an ideologically specific phenomenon, as we've determined,
yeah,
and then go mail their employees or their employers and their customers.
yeah. No, and like that's like a model of activism that like I don't particularly engage in, but like it's there, right?
People
And
do it,
like
you know.
and it's not necessarily illegal, and it's within their freedom of speech, right? To
Yeah.
like tell on you. So there's those elements like where we get mostly concerned is like where things amount to criminality and thus like mostly are incitements to hate-based violence of different sorts. So like I don't really care about like whether you share Peppa the Frog memes, like go do that. But like when you start calling for like mass atrocities or like are actually sharing like manuals on how to build bombs, etc., like that's where things go from like what's legal in most places to being illegal in most places, and that's
And
where
this is also
like you
sometimes
step beyond just like content moderation and into like actually having to engage law
report
enforcement
that.
as well. Yeah.
And this is the famous case of the one of the Myanmar in the Facebook papers.
Yeah.
That this is obviously legal, whether under national law or international law, and nobody did anything about it because they just had the resources, they didn't care or whatever. And I think it's worth really just mentioning again the concept. For me, I'm a big fan of the idea, not the phenomenon, of stochastic terrorism being a real thing, where people are whether it's explicitly or more subtly calling for violence, calling
Yeah.
for. I think there's a couple of American legal concepts. I think one of them was imminent criminal action or something like that. One of
Yeah,
for
there's like imminent
present
risk of
danger.
harm and stuff like that,
Yeah,
right?
where
And
you're
so
actually saying, "Let's go
yeah.
kill that guy."
Yeah, where like imminent threats to life is like usually when we call our friends at the FBI or Europol or
Imminent
whichever.
lawless action is the term I
Yeah,
was thinking of. Right.
that's another one, right? Again, like lawless action has like a pretty wide spectrum, and like different legislatures are quite different when it comes to things like scams, frauds, all of these things as well, which like definitely like also are part of the ecosystem that we're looking at, right? Um,
I think this is a good point, though, to move into one really important concept that you mentioned in our preparatory conversation, which is obligations,
yeah,
right? So the obligations of individuals, of organizations, of governments. Yeah.
yeah,
So freedom of speech online. Um, the often cited thing is that a commercial platform has no obligation to guarantee your freedom of speech on their commercial platform.
yep,
Unless, I mean, there is obviously the gray area that you mentioned. If they have monopolized on online discourse, but with the increasing demise of Twitter because of reasons, um,
yeah.
that
That's
it
and
looks
also like that ends up in like antitrust law territory real quick, right? Where
yeah.
like the platforms are like, hey, we don't have monopoly.
But
And
the Agora, I see. I'm a big fan of Blue Sky, right?
yeah,
Even though but it seems like the Agora may be opening up a little bit again.
yeah,
Mastodon, things like that, popping up. But organ, there's a big issue with organizations in the trust and safety space. They work with social media,
yeah,
with the Teutonic, as your Freudian slip there, tectonic shift in the U.S. recently. Sorry,
sure.
that's actually good. I like that.
Yeah,
I've sensed a dramatic reluctance on the part of quote unquote big tech companies to engage with these social responsibility initiatives, and that's something that a lot of people in the trust and safety space are seem to be almost afraid to pick up because your FANGs, your Twitter, whatever, they still wield a lot of power. Right. So we don't want to piss them off
yeah.
too much. But what is their obligation to society? What is their legal obligation? And then going a bit deeper, what should governments be doing? What should individuals be doing to engage, to protect each other, to ensure that this people are safe online? And it's, it's, you mentioned you want to prevent people from getting killed,
Yeah.
people from being physically harmed, but you also in our last plus one chat, you mentioned cultural damage,
Yeah.
right? Does harm going to, you are traumatizing me, you are hurting me, you're hurting, the thing right wingers very often you see this fuck your feelings idea, right? What do we need to do to protect people? Where are the limits? And who has what obligations here?
I think one thing is fuck your feelings, but also like the other thing, or like the counter argument is it's not really about feelings at some point. Like if you are consistently threatened with like rape every time you voice your opinion online, as is the case for many women and particular female politicians, like if that is the consequence or cost of you like tweeting, is that you get like 12,000 rape threats, like that de facto, like it
Absolutely
isn't. Yeah,
shocking revelation for me as a straight male, right?
yeah,
About as Caucasian straight male as it gets, to see the kind of shit that my wife and my female colleagues and others put up with just by being online. Like
right.
you dare to join this manosphere here.
And so, like, as white Caucasian men, like, I feel like we have a responsibility to like use our privilege to like make the world a little bit better for other people.
Very
So
least
that's
not make it worse, at the very
yeah,
low bar there.
that's a pretty low bar. Make it better would be preferable.
Yeah.
But if the consequences of you going online is that you're met with like 12,000 rape threats every time you're like tweeting about politics, then like the likelihood of you running for election is just like non-existent. Like, so we've seen like female candidates are already underrepresented in politics, and then met with that, we see withdrawals from politics, right? I'm speaking of like female friends who have been running for office and things like that in different ways, and like they're just like not putting up with it anymore, and that makes 100% sense. And it's not about feelings; it's about like you are met with threats of rape and death every time you
It's also
voice
like
your
natural.
opinion.
It's also just, I mean, let's take, it's not just sexism, obviously, because,
Yeah,
racism, there's all kinds of stuff, the homophobia. But I mean,
yeah,
one thing that really shocked me when I was working at a large international bank a few years ago, many years ago, right? And just like with male colleagues who are educated, urbane, cosmopolitan types, right? Very, very decent guys. I think, and they just like make some casual comments where I was like, look, it's just kind of, I mean, it wasn't like meant to be hurtful, right?
yeah,
But I was like, that's gross.
yeah.
It's not
Uh,
like
so,
they're not like being aggressively misogynistic, but they're just like, this is kind of like just
and it's also like it's just unnecessary in order to like have
unnecessary.
civil discourse, right? And so yeah,
But so given that, we
yeah,
we have a social media platform,
yeah,
Bjørn and John's awesome forum, right? We
yeah,
are we are in a liberal democratic country with freedom of speech, but also obligations to protect against calls for genocide, calls for murder, rape threats, whatever.
yeah.
What do you think legally, but also I think morally and ethically is the obligation of say a platform that they should be held to by not only their users but also their sponsors and investors?
So there's a couple of layers to your question. Like one thing is like what is the legal responsibility? And again, that varies from legislature to legislature. In the European Union right now, we have the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, we have the Terrorist Content Online Regulation, etc. That is enforceable law that dictates what responsibilities platforms have when it comes to terrorist content. And so, like, terrorist content is illegal, like, in a massive market. It being a massive market matters, a massive market in terms of capital primarily, like advertising money in Europe. If you block all of Europe from your social media platform, that's going to hurt your bottom line, basically. And so you have a responsibility if you want to keep operating in Europe to follow that legislation.
And this, by the way, I think this is an interesting point, just real quickly. This is, I think, something that has also kept a lot of the authoritarian countries that, misuse the term terrorism that we talked about in our first episode from abusing this, because they're just not, okay, maybe China, but generally they're just not big enough to have an impact.
Yeah. And like China's got their own social media
That's
platforms.
true. Yeah. The Weibo and company. Yeah.
Yeah. So like there's the alternative social media company countries like VK in Russia, WeChat in China, etc. Like a massive platforms that just aren't touched by European legislation that much because like not that many people in Europe are using these platforms. They tend to be okay in terms of like moderation as well. Actually, they tend to lean over into the authoritarian sometimes, and etc. But like the financial aspect there is one key component of like if you're pulling out of Europe, you're losing a shit ton of advertising money. Like let's face it.
But also what we saw with Twitter, with advertisers increasingly pulling out too slowly, for my opinion, when you started seeing Nazis basically getting free reign on the platform.
Yeah, and that goes into like another layer really, but like at the fundamental layer of legislation as well, like you can be asked to shut down or you can be fined quite heavily. And we've kind of just in the last couple of weeks.
Do you think the fines are sufficient?
Not really. I think like you can write them off as taxes basically in some respects.
If it doesn't hurt, it's a fee. It's
right. And so like that might be the perception, but we've seen quite hefty fines through the Digital Markets Act, in particular, in the last couple of weeks, which might yield interesting results in changing company behavior, right? But I think like the real tax is on advertiser money, and like advertisers pulling out. Twitter is one good example where like Twitter's been consistently losing money quite well. But
it's not worth $43 billion?
Probably not, man. Sorry to say it. But also, like whether like the purpose of buying Twitter was something else is like we can go into theories there.
That's another question entirely.
Yeah. But also like purely financial, like pulling out the entire advertising market of Europe is not something you want to do if you're running a company, right? Yeah. And so advertisers have a responsibility for like which platforms are they willing to advertise on, what content do they want their brands associated with. And this is where like one thing is the financial revenue models of the companies, but where like things can hurt on the bottom line there, but then also the reputational risk. And what that means. So if your platform becomes basically just Nazi bots liking the content of other Nazi bots, then like you have your own little weird ecosystem, but like users are going to move to somewhere else. And we've seen users in droves move away from some of the platforms that used to be heavy hitters, right?
I think this also raises the idea of what can individuals do. I read once when I was in business school, I read, this thing. There's always different numbers, but for every person that actually bothers to mail the marketing or public relations department of a company saying they're pissed off, there's between 7, 10, 14, 20 others that don't bother out there that are just going to stop buying your product because they're annoyed. I think the same goes for the users, for the ones who are everyone that's vocal about, hey, this is not okay. And I think this goes in the obligation of us as individuals. Everybody who speaks up, there's going to be, 20 other people or however many out there who are disgruntled and following along and just going like, I don't have time for this.
Yeah. No, I think like that's fair, right? But also like advertisers wants to be where there's users. So like,
exactly.
Leave the platform, but also like write the advertising department, but also like rate the department at the company that's selling the ads in the first place, right? And so like there's this whole dynamic of all of that, and like the companies are going to still like be cranking out numbers of saying like we had this many views from like some server in the basement somewhere, and like not all of that is going to be disingenuous, but not all of it's going to be.
Of course,
either. And so like
there's always going to be some number fudging, but I think that's a really good observation there, because no matter what level of regulation we have to protect the integrity and the safety of online discourse is always going to, a lot of it is as little as you may like capitalism. Capitalism sometimes, it is often a major driver of engendering change. Be aware of that and use that.
But back to kind of the concept of brand safety, like the companies, the social media platforms are interested in safety of their brands, right? Like if you are a responsible company that has shareholders that you care about, like you don't want your company to be associated with a Nazi hellhole.
Well, you also want to be aware. You also want to be aware of, little plug for your services here. You also want to be aware of who these people are and understanding, having essentially market intelligence, right?
So like a lot of what we do is working with companies in order to like make sure that people behave on their platforms in order to make their platforms be nicer places to be. And so like by being a nicer place to be, like you'll have more people be there, and
that means more money for you.
Will pay you more money. So there's one side of like brand safety there, but then also on the advertiser side of the dial, where like you as a company that's buying ad space wants to know which contexts your advertising is showing up in, and like we can also help on that side and help you understand like whether Nazis are using your shirt as uniform this day, right? Like,
I can imagine any brand right now, but
yeah, which is bad for business at the end of the day.
And it tends to be,
so there's that
the
side,
Nazi
but also
market
like
is not big enough to sustain a single,
Well, there's like little t-shirt shops in Slovakia, but like other than that, there's limits to how much ratio I'll have on that.
So we've got about eight minutes left. Let's end on a positive note.
Yeah.
And let's talk about survivors. What do you call them?
Sure.
Some people object to the term victims of terrorism, right? Let's talk about people who've been through the ringer. I'm talking to one right now, right? People who have been personally affected by this, either physically or online. You mentioned the rape and death threats, the doxing, whatever online. People who have suffered the consequences of a terror attack in person, whether it's a bombing or stabbing or seen it. And there's questions of, well, what is PTSD? People who are indirectly affected by it. What can we do to support these people online? Offline, what are some, there's lots of mechanisms. There's support mechanisms for survivors. There's platforms and forums. What are some things that we as individuals and societies could and should be doing to not only spot and mitigate the actual activities of these turds online, but help people who are directly affected by it deal more effectively with the consequences of it?
I think showing up is like step one, right? And like more people than you realize have been affected by terrorism in different ways. Like terrorism, I tend to say, is like low prevalence, high cost in many ways, but also low prevalence still means that like a lot of people have either like seen a terrorist attack reasonably up close, seen friends go through things, etc. Like there's several degrees to that, but also like had their businesses impacted by terrorism in different ways, etc. And so like there's like the circles of proximity are like reasonably wide, where like I can fairly safely say like everyone in Norway knows someone who's survived a terrorist attack, right? And so I think it's worth thinking about like there's like a concept of like when someone is diagnosed with like terminal illness, there's like the person is the center of the attention, and then like their immediate family is the center of attention, and then there's like the circles of like who this is about, and you're always supposed to like point inwards from where you are. So like you don't ask the people in the circles inside of your circle to like care for you. Like the people who are diagnosed with the illness are not supposed to be the ones caring for their family, but their family also needs care, right? Like there's a visual somewhere that you can link in some notes. But I think that applies to this as well. So like showing up for the people who are affected by terrorism in different ways than you is probably the best way. Being a good ally, making space and ensuring that those spaces are kind of like as safe as possible for people to operate in, etc. Like all of that is good stuff. And so like at the end of the day, I think like showing up is number one on how to deal with survivors. And then also like hearing survivors and understanding that there's a lot of different ways of dealing with your own trauma, as well as a lot of different ways of like everyone's on their own little journey when it comes to healing, but also on their own little journeys when it comes to how they want the public to deal with terrorism and violent extremism, right? And so there's no kind of one answer fits all situation. And I think we've had a tendency to like think of survivors like a fairly homogenous group in terms of like what they need, and what they are. And so yeah, kind of just breaking that up and like treating people as individuals and with respect tends to be the way
what
to
a
go.
concept.
Yeah, and it's shocking.
I think also one thing I have this thing about, never argue with people on the internet, because there's a very high likelihood that somebody is either a troll, they're cynical, they're 15 years old, they're mentally ill, they're just having a bad day. And it kind of goes in the area of, never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, but the pig enjoys it. So you'll never solve anything with an argument online. But I think one thing that we can also do is when you see stuff like this, just call it out.
Yeah.
Just
No,
say,
like
look, just shut up. Just, this is not okay, right?
shutting down bullshit is like a
Shut
good
it
way to
down.
go. Also, like moderating your own Facebook page and like stuff like that. Like you can hide stuff, you can delete stuff, you can block people. Like it's fine.
Also, if somebody is making comments like that, just, look, it doesn't hurt anybody if you just say, this is not cool, because then,
Yeah,
other people who see this, they begin, I think it kind of helps. I think maybe just more impressionable people understand that maybe this is not representative, and there are people who find this not, this not acceptable. Obviously, we're not going to go into your teragrams or whatever, and your 8chans,
no,
but unless you're really, really dedicated researcher, thank you, Bjørn and company. But especially in more public fora where they would have access to people who are maybe more impressionable and more vulnerable to being, at least accepting that kind of content, we
yeah.
can make a bit of a difference.
I think another thing that I was thinking about in a lot of trust and safety contexts is like we've been working a lot with people who are victims of image-based sexual abuse and things like that. Right?
Put a link, by the way, to in the comments for a good site, to a good organization to talk to about that.
Yeah. And for them, the imagery itself is a crime, right?
Mm.
And so, like, one of the things that we're thinking a lot about is like for survivors of terrorism, the act of terrorism is often the crime, right? Like the image in itself of that isn't the crime. And so, like, it's different spheres of like where you're thinking about like where did the crime actually occur, and this is kind of more important to lawyers than anyone else in some way, shape, or form. But also it is important in terms of like how we are shaping policy. But that's not to say that like me showing up in terrorist propaganda as a survivor of terrorism is good or should be allowed, right? Like, so we need to think about like the different layers of harm as well, and how that is affecting the individuals, and like where that harm actually occurs, and like who's actually legally responsible for that. And there's again layers of complexity to all of that,
And it goes back into also the free speech thing a little bit, where some countries, again Germany is a good example. You have the right to your own image, right? And these are all kinds of that we can use to fight hate, through legal channels.
But at the same time, also like that leads into one of the big challenges that we haven't touched upon, which is like where do you draw the line between reporting and like legitimate things like bystander footage used in news about terrorism, versus where that becomes then basically image-based harm against victims and survivors of that act of terrorism, right? And so lots of nuance to that one as well.
Thankfully, neither of us are lawyers. Sorry.
Yeah, keep trying to remind people that.
Listen, we're coming up on time. I wanna thank you very, very sincerely for your time, your insights, your experience, your wisdom, the work that you're doing. maybe we have an opportunity to talk a little bit further on this. And I want to encourage everybody to check out Bjørn's activity. I'll link to it, Cyan as well. And I wish you all a very safe and successful next couple of days and weeks. And stay safe online. Take care.
Yeah, stay safe, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure.